going. Okay.
Okay. So again, thanks for coming. And then make sure before you leave, you thank the gentleman working here and grab some stuff like usual. Like I kind of recommend, if you want to. I mean, you don't absolutely have to, but that's kind of a good thing. Remember also for the test, there are going to be 3 essay questions per class period. You're going to pick 2 essay questions, and those are going to be randomly given out to the class. Okay. So, like I got 4 stacks of copies that are different colors. First person I see in the door, I'm going to ask what color do you want. They're not going to see the questions at all. They pick the color. That's what period 1 gets. Period 2, I'm going to do the same thing. Period 3, I'm going to do the same thing. Period 7, you get whatever's left, right? So all of the videos are linked and posted on the wiki. So if you check on the wiki, I put a link to the videos and I discuss those in class. So I'm not going to talk about the essays specifically, but if you did the Twitter chat or you look at the questions that are on for the Twitter chat, those are aligned with the essay, okay? So, what I will talk about now is the multiple choice section, or I should say matching section. So the test is going to be 70 questions, matching. There's 7 chapters, so there's 10 questions per chapter, and it's all in groups of 10. So that part, I think, should go pretty quick for you because there's clearly one answer. There's no like wrong answer in the group. There's no like extra options that you wouldn't use, right? So everything has one answer and there's no extra options. So 10 questions per chapter, 7 chapters. And then the remaining 30 points will be from the 2 essays that you pick out of the 3 that you're given. So chapter 1 was an overview on the science of psychology. And as an aside, I would say if I were going to study this, I would try to focus on the end of the chapter reviews, as well as a lot of the terms, and think about what I emphasized in the notes, because I pulled out, as I was building this test, I pulled out concepts that I emphasized in the notes. So, but it's all in the text, okay? So if you remember, also think about the assignments we did. I tried to align the test with some of the assignments that we did. So does anybody remember what the chapter 1 assignment was? The chart that you had to complete? Yeah. What was that about?
The perspectives.
Yeah, the 8 perspectives. Okay. So let's go through the 8 perspectives, talk about briefly what they are, and then who some of the main people are. Taylor mentioned the psychodynamic perspective first. That's the modern version of the older psychoanalytical perspective. What are some key words that are tied to the psychodynamic perspective? Key words tied to the psychodynamic perspective. Yeah, Freud is the main theorist, correct. What else?
Is it like early childhood experiences?
Okay, early experiences. Yep. Subconscious and unconscious. Good. And then what else? Remember I talked about in the Freudian perspective you have what's called the eros and the thanatos. What are those? Those are drives, right? Drives or motivations. So Freud again is the main theorist. Unconscious or subconscious, we talked about that, and how those things shape the rest of your life later. Okay, besides the psychodynamic approach, what's another approach? Humanistic is another one. Who are some of the main theorists for that? We haven't gotten to that one in large detail yet, but like each of these theories has a chapter that's aligned with it, basically. Okay, so who are some of the main theorists from the humanistic perspective? If you've been in the child development class, you've talked about one of them. It's like a pyramid looking thing, and it has needs, and then base needs you have to fulfill until you get to what they call self-actualized. That guy's name's Abraham Maslow, and then another guy is Carl Rogers. So again, the humanistic perspective emerges kind of as a counter to the psychodynamic perspective and also to the behavioral perspective. Because they didn't like in the psychodynamic perspective, everybody's kind of evil at their core or selfish, right? And then from the behavioral perspective, you don't have free will. You're just responding to stimulus in your environment, okay? So the humanistic came as a response to those, and it saes you do have free will. human potential is basically good. There's a lot of human potential, and everybody inherently strives for the top of that pyramid that Maslow called self-actualization. So I talked about another one of the main perspectives, the behavioral perspective. Who are some of the main people in the behavioral perspective? Watson.
Skinner.
Yep. John Watson, B.F. Skinner. Who's the guy that discovered it? Pavlov, exactly. So what are the two schools of thought in the behaviorist perspective? Two processes that they study the most would be on the way to look at. Classical and operant conditioning, good. So that's all about how stimulus in your environment shapes your action. Okay, what's another one of the main perspectives? What's another one of the main perspectives? Cognitive, yeah. So cognitive is all about mental processes, right? So cognition, thinking, memory, intelligence, all of those things. Okay, what's another one of the main perspectives? Evolutionary. Okay, and that's just tied directly to evolutionary theory. So if you think, what's evolution about? Okay, as it applies to humans, so what's evolution about? Okay. In terms of its relationship to, remember in psychology we have behavior and mental processes, right? So, yeah, so how like biologically passed down characteristics through genetics shape human behavior and mental processes. Okay, what's another one of the main perspectives? Social psychology, yeah, or socio-cultural, yeah. So social psychology. And what's that focused on? Yeah, interpersonal interaction. So how, when you're relating to people in groups, how that affects your behavior. Okay, we got two more left. What are the other two? Both of them start with the same prefix. Biological is one. Biopsychosocial is the other. So let's start with biological. What's that going to focus on?
Behavior.
Both of them, well, all the perspectives are going to look at behavior and mental processes, but so biological does both of that, but how do they focus? Okay, the way you phrase that there, that's more evolutionary, right? So the biological approach is going to, like, we'll take somebody, draw their blood, or try to do brain scans, try to see what's going on at that moment. So hormones, brain structure, brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, disease, things like that, and how they influence behavior and mental processes. And then the last one, the biopsychosocial, kind of tries to see how all those things work together. So if you look at somebody that is involved in like a social situation that's really, really stressful all the time, that alters their brain structure, their brain functioning at least. It doesn't alter their structure in the sense like they develop new parts, but it changes how different neurotransmitters interact, right? Okay. Also in this chapter is a little bit of discussion about experiments, okay? So if you remember with experiments, let's talk about a basic experimental design. What are the two groups called if you set up an experiment? Control and an experimental group, good. Okay. When you do that experiment, then how do you tell the difference between those groups? What's changing? What are the terms?
What you control and what you want to change as you go.
Yep. So what are the terms for those things in general called? Variables? We're the only people in here now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I can push a little louder then. Okay, so variables, right?
Constant.
I don't think we use the term constant. But what else? What are the variables called? The terms for them? Independent and dependent variables. Good. So what's the difference between those two then? Okay, one is one that the experimenters actually control, and and then one is that the experimenters are trying to observe. So let's use the example that I used in class a couple times, was coffee and reaction time, right? So I give half of you water with caffeine in it, or coffee that's not decaffeinated, let's phrase it that way. And then the other half I give decaffeinated coffee, right? So what's the independent variable in that instance? The presence of coffee or not, okay? Or caffeine, yep. What's the dependent variable? Reaction time, okay? So be able to identify like some other examples of that. Think of some other scenarios that will help you with that question, okay? All right, so that's kind of the core stuff for chapter 1. Let's talk about chapter 2 a little bit. Chapter 2 is focused on the biological perspective. Biological perspective, again, is nervous system, brain anatomy, neurons, all that stuff, right? So with the nervous system, you can divide it into parts, right? What are the two? You start nervous system on the top. Think of the graphic and the text, right, where they divide it out. What are the two divisions of the nervous system there? Central and peripheral, okay? What physical parts are the focus of the central nervous system?
Spine.
Brain and spinal cord. Okay, peripheral is what? Other nerves. Remember the drawing in the text? It's got all the nerves going out all over the place. Good. Okay, so you can divide out parts of the nervous system further into subparts as well. One way to divide that out includes the autonomic and somatic. And again, if you look in the text, there's a graphic that divides this out pretty well. So, what kind of stuff does the autonomic nervous system control? What's that? Okay, things that are going to go on automatically without you having to think about them. Autonomic, automatic means the same thing. Okay? How about somatic? Yeah, voluntary muscles, right? So you move your hand up, move your hand down, all that somatic. Heart rate, respiration, autonomic. Good. Okay, you can subdivide some of those further even when you talk about what's called the sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? What does the sympathetic do? Fight or flight response? Generally speaking, it speeds stuff up or increases the functioning of things. There are a few exceptions to that, as in the case of digestion, but generally speaking, the sympathetic nervous system speeds stuff up. Okay, what's the other one? Parasympathetic. Again, generally speaking, that slows stuff down. So it's like bad stuff happens, like crazy Charlie Hebdo style shooter like they had in France right now, right? What's going to jump into action for us? Sympathetic. Thankfully, I'm in the corner, so I got a lot of shields here, right? No, I'd be going after the guy. I'm not going to be the guy hiding in the corner getting shot. It's like I'm going down swinging. You know what I mean? So I'd weave my way between you guys and then pick up a table and try to take them out or something. I don't know. But so sympathetic's going to jump, kick off, right? And then afterwards, theoretically, a scenario like that happens. Police show up. We all calm down. Parasympathetic's going to kind of try to slow things down. Okay? All right, what's the term for the basic unit, the most basic unit of the nervous system? What? A neuron, right? So the basic unit of the nervous system is a neuron. There's other cells in the nervous system as well, but the support cells we didn't really focus on. So with a neuron, you have, again, some key parts. You've got the axon. What does the axon do? Okay, so it's the pathway that the signal goes across. Kind of like a telephone wire is what they use. So it doesn't go across from one neuron to another, but it travels across the neuron itself. So then when it gets to the end, it's going to reach a gap. What's that gap called? Synapse. Okay, and at that gap there's electrical signals that tell the cell to kick out what? To kick out chemicals. What are those chemicals called? Neurotransmitters, yeah. Now, when you get smarter, you're learning about stuff. Different connections expand. What are those expansions called? Dendrites. Okay, so it's not like when you practice something a whole bunch, your neurons fundamentally alter, like they completely grow new parts that didn't exist before. The dendrites just get more spread out, like they expand, they connect in more areas. Okay? What's the term for a nerve impulse? Nerve impulse, 2 words. Action potential, okay? Action potentials operate under what's called the all or none rule, right? What does that mean? They either fire or they don't. So I take my finger here and I flick Lucas in the forehead lightly, or I take my hat, like hit him as hard as I can, or I pick up that kid chair and smack him in the face, right? So more neurons are firing, but they're not firing more intensely, okay? So that's the difference in sensation experiences. Okay, so let's shift now to lobes in the brain. How many lobes are there?
4.
How many lobes in the brain are there? 4 lobes, okay? What's here? Frontal lobe. What do you have here? Parietal. What do you have here? Temporal. And then what's here? Occipital, okay? What are some functions that occur mostly in the frontal lobe? Okay. Reasoning, complex thought processes, executive functioning, and so on, okay? Parietal has to do with like the sensation and feeling in a lot of your limbs and in your body. Temporal is involved with speech production, largely. And then how about occipital? Yep, sight. Good. Okay, we also talked about other parts of the brain as well, not the lobes, but like the limbic system and other parts as well. Which part is affiliated mostly with physical processes in terms of controlling your body? So you learn how to ride a bike, swing a baseball bat, whatever. What is that? It'd be right here in your brain. Cerebellum. Good. So the bulk of your brain is the cerebrum, right? But the part in the back here that controls a lot of those physical things is the cerebellum. Remember also we talked about the divisions, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, right? Which of those 3 controls most of the autonomic function? Forebrain, midbrain, or hindbrain? Hindbrain does. Yep. So pons, brainstem, medulla, stuff like that. Okay. In the limbic system, we also talked about a couple of different things. One is specifically tied to the formation of new memories. What is that? Hippocampus, exactly. Good. We also talked about something that was tied to fear, memories related to fear, anger, some other emotions. What is that? The amygdala. Remember one of the videos we watched talked about the guys that had slightly smaller amygdalas? That was in the brain video. Remember also we talked about the hypothalamus. What does the hypothalamus do? What does the hypothalamus do? Hypothalamus. Nobody wants to get it wrong. They say that it has a lot to do with regulating temperature, regulating a variety of other drives and activities we have, like thirst, sleeping, hunger, stuff like that. Then also you have something called the thalamus, right? What does the thalamus do? Yeah, so it's situated largely in the middle, right? Sensory information comes in, and then the thalamus is basically like, what do we need to do with this? And then it sends it out to different parts, okay? So based on the reactions I got from you guys, you should look through graphics and try to see like what's this part, what does it do? Just real basic level, okay? Make sense? So I'd probably focus on that a little bit. Okay, that leads us to chapter 3. If you remember, chapter 3 was the lab we did in class. What was the lab? What was that all about? Yeah, so we did a little cinnamon thing the day before, but then we had all the water and I played music loud and stuff, right? So that's on sensation and perception. So when I had the bottles of water and I had some that were plain, some that had salt, and some that had sugar in it, what was I trying to assess or test there? Absolute threshold. So this jug has plain water in it, and then your trying jugs, the first time you can tell that there's some sugar in it, you've reached the absolute threshold, right? Now, if you remember also in there, the salt ones, there was one that had a ton of salt, okay? And then there was one that had a lot of salt, but not quite as much. So your ability to tell the difference between like 2 teaspoons of salt and 4 teaspoons of salt, what is that called? Difference, threshold, or just noticeable difference? Yeah. Okay, so there's a principle that's at work here. It's actually a sensation and perception law. It's called Weber's law or Weber's law. What does that state? Well, they always operate under 50% of the time. So absolute threshold, we've got regular water here, we've got just a little bit of salt here. If you can tell that there's salt water in it 50% of the time, you reach the absolute threshold. Just noticeable difference, if you can get it right 50% of the time, same thing, right? So what does Weber's law state though? Weber's law had to do with proportionality, if you remember. So I don't know what this is. I'm just kind of making the scenario up. But let's say that you can tell the difference. I've got teaspoons, okay? And I'm going from 4 teaspoons to 5 teaspoons of sugar in the water. Now you can tell the difference, right? If I have 40 teaspoons of sugar, how many more do I have to add to tell the difference? 10 more, because the proportion stays the same, okay? That's Weber's law. Does that make sense? So you can use that for anything. Sight, taste, all senses, it stays the same. So if I am lifting and I have 10 pounds and I add a pound, I can tell the difference, right? If I have 100 pounds, how much do I have to add to be able to tell the difference? Assuming that's the right, I'm just making the numbers up, I don't know. But if I can tell the difference between 10 and 11, but nothing between, if I have 100 pounds, I have to add 10 pounds, okay? Does that make sense? That's Weber's law. Okay, we also talked about vision. We did an activity with vision there, right? One of them involved somebody standing behind you or besides you with a colored pencil, and then they moved it like this until you could see it, right? You could see it first, but you couldn't tell what color it was until they got like here, okay? Why is that? Cones see color, but they're focused in the middle of your field of vision, right? They're not off to the side. Rods have to do with seeing in the dark, seeing movement, seeing in black and white. We also talked about a number of different things that had to do with perceptual clues and rules of sensation and perception. So I showed a variety of different things. One of them was the classic vases or faces illusion, where it's black and you see either the white. I think in that one the white is the faces and black is the vases. Is that right? Or the other way around? Okay, so in that instance, what was the sensation or perceptual influence principle that we were operating under? What's that called? The tendency for you to perceive something as either being like in the front or the back of something. Figure ground relationship or figure ground perception. Yep. We also talked about a couple of other things, like if I always look for something. Oh, okay. So the lights, right? have lights. Okay, let's say we couldn't see. It was somehow it was so dark and lights were so focused that we could all we could see was the actual light in the circle there and not the rest of the wall, right? So all these lights together, we would interpret them as like a rectangle, right? What is that called? What perceptual cue is that called? Like connect the dots. Works like this. Constellations. So you see stars formed in an area, forms the Big Dipper or Orion or whatever. What is that called? Well, Gestalt principles of organization is just the broad term. What would this be specifically? In the text, they have a bunch of drawings related to this. You guys should look that up also. That one's called closure, specifically. Closure. Yep. Yeah, so I draw a circle and I leave just the very little top. You're going to still interpret it as a circle. Okay, that's closure. We also talked about the line illusions. That has to do with their position and where they're at and how they get perceived to be equal length when in reality they're not. So they did the railroad tracks to kind of demonstrate that a little bit, and they also had the room where it like looked like it was one size, but then you changed and it looked another way. And they had the table. I played a video clip in some classes. I didn't play it in all classes, but where they took the table and they asked you which one's this longer, and you look at it, and the one on the left looks like it's longer, right? And then they rotate it, and they're actually the same length. You remember that one? That one always gets me. But that illusion is named after two guys that discovered it. That one's called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So you should look up some of those, okay? Look up those illusions and make sure that you understand those. So last thing, what's the difference between sensation and perception? Give some examples. Difference between sensation and perception. Difference between sensation and perception.
Sensation's something you like feel, perception's like how you interpret it.
Yeah, sensation is just the raw data coming in from your environment, from your senses. Perception is how you put that together to create meaning. Okay, so that leads us to chapter 4. Chapter 4 was on consciousness. So if you remember, I had you watch a couple of videos and take notes on them. A couple of them were the crash course videos, and then one of them was that Russell Foster on why we sleep. So consciousness, we don't really, if you look at the chapter, there was only like 1 or 2 pages on consciousness itself, and then the rest of the chapter talked about altered states of consciousness. So what were some of the main altered states of consciousness that they gave us? We kind of discussed 3 main types. Hypnosis is one, sleep was another,
Drugs.
and then drugs. Yep, being under the influence of drugs was the other one. Good. Let's start with sleep. Now, remember also from the text that different people define the stages differently. So, most models you're going to see either have 3 stages of sleep and then REM sleep, or 4 stages of sleep and then REM sleep, right? So, let's start with REM sleep. What is REM sleep? What does that stand for, first of all? Rapid eye movement. So, what is the brain, when they do scans of the brain during REM sleep, what does it look like? A bunch of activity, similar to when somebody's awake, right? So, let's say you don't sleep that much, you don't get as much REM sleep. What happens afterwards? Like, you finally do get sleep. Is the percentage of REM sleep you get, is it going to go up or go down? It's going to go up. What do they call that? REM rebound. Yep. What else occurs during REM sleep? Dreaming. Good. Okay, let's talk about another stage. The first stage, if we go by the ones that start with N, for like non-REM sleep, what would the first stage be called then? Starts with N, it's pretty easy. what's the first stage? N1, right? Okay, so in N1 you're gonna see theta waves, that's the style waves, there's a graphic in the text that explains this. And then that's also, where is, she's not here. Somebody in period 3 that I was picking on about this. But I don't see anybody else here that really falls asleep. It looks like they struggle in class too much. But pick on Janae a little bit, so she's pretty good most of the time though. But let's just say she's in class and she's going like this, and then she goes like this, right? What's that called? Yeah, she's engaged in microsleep, but that like sensation that she's falling and then she kind of wakes up. What's that called? That's called a hypnic jerk. I thought I heard somebody say it. Over there? There you go. Okay, and then you'll also, there'll be like hallucinations that you'll see that. So this is like bad, but if you drive and you're really, really tired, have you ever could have swore you saw something? That's what it was, right? So that means you're like engaged in microsleeps while you're driving. You have to stop driving, okay? Okay, now, what stage is it that most people consider the deepest stage of sleep, where the brain is the least active, where growth hormone is released, where a lot of physical recovery occurs?
3.
What's up?
3.
And 3. Good. Okay, so let's talk about some sleep disorders then. And I'm going to ask you, I'll tell you the name of it, and I want to ask you to say like when it occurs, some other information about it, stuff like that. Okay? So, night terrors. Night terrors. When do night terrors occur? Yeah, more common in children, that's true. What stage of sleep? N3, good. Are night terrors remembered or not? No. Okay, nightmares. REM sleep, again, mostly, so 90-95%. Okay, nightmares, are they remembered? At least right away. I mean, you'll lose some of that. If you go back to sleep, wake up, you won't remember all the details, but they are remembered. Okay, how about narcolepsy? When does that occur? So you're awake, right, when narcolepsy hits? And then what is the description of that? What happens? Yeah, so you randomly fall asleep without a lot of notice. In some real extreme instances of that, they experience what's called cataplexy, where they just like hit the floor. So not a good thing. They lose muscle control is what happens. Okay, how about sleep apnea? What is that? Stop breathing in your sleep. When does that occur? No, I don't think the text specified, and I think that happens whenever. So I could be wrong on that, but I think it happens whenever. Regardless, if I say I could be wrong on that, what do you know? Like that part's specifically not on the test. Okay, let's go back to nightmares. I have a nightmare and I see a big purple giraffe that's talking in German, and it's saying like Heil Hitler as it's chasing me. Okay? That'd be really messed up, right? The actual purple giraffe speaking German would be called what? The manifest content, good. That I'm afraid of animals rising up and taking control of the world, like evil dictators. What would that be? A latent content. So be able to identify some scenarios with that. Okay, also in the text where it talks about drugs, you're going to want to look at the table that talks about the drugs, what they do, what class they're part of, and what like the general symptoms are, okay? Studying that table probably will be the best thing to help you prepare for the class, for the test specifically. So, what is a class of drugs that leads to distortions in sensation and perception? Hallucinogens, good. Okay, what are some examples of hallucinogens? Somebody said acid or LSD, good. Okay, mushrooms, PCP, MDMA or ecstasy, What else? Marijuana. Good. Okay. How about drugs that slow the nervous system? Depressants. What are some examples of that? Alcohol, benzodiazepines, other narcotics. Okay. And then what's another major class of drugs? Stimulants. The most used drug in the world is a member of this class. What is that? Caffeine. Yep. What else fits in that? Stimulants. Nicotine. Coke. Okay. Methamphetamines, other amphetamines. Good. So be able to identify what parts those influence, what the names are, and then what they do. Okay? Okay. That leads us to chapter 5. Chapter 5, if you remember, was on learning. What was the assignment on chapter 5? You had the table you had to make, right? One side was classical conditioning, and one side was operant conditioning. So let's go through and let's make sure that you understand all of those pieces specifically. Mark a lot of this down so I remember. Okay, so classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Let's use the Pavlov example because people are familiar with that, and we'll go from there. In Pavlov's example, he was studying digestion in dogs, and he found that eventually he didn't even have to have the food or the meat powder with him. He'd just ring the bell and the dogs would start to salivate, right? Before the conditioning occurred at all, what would the bell be called? Neutral stimulus, because it doesn't produce the desired response. It's going to produce some response. It could be something that will produce a response, but is it producing the response that you're seeking? The answer is no, it's neutral, okay? So then you ring the bell, you present food, ring the bell, present food, ring the bell, present food. That process is called acquisition. You're acquiring a classically conditioned response. So at that point in time, now the food gets paired with the neutral stimulus, and the neutral stimulus becomes what? The conditioned stimulus. What is the food called? The unconditioned stimulus. So if it's something that affects the person or the dog or the organism, it's always a stimulus, right? If it's something the organism does, it's always the response. Now in the case of classical conditioning, the response is the same behavior. So then how do you tell whether it's the conditioned or unconditioned response? What causes it? Yeah, what causes it? So if the bell causes it, what would it be? Conditioned response. If the food causes it, it is the unconditioned response. Now, after conditioning, what happens to the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response? Do they change? No, they stay the same, right? Okay, so another example I used in class was my buddy that drank Coke with Windsor and got really sick. Okay, what would the Windsor be? Or I should say, what would the alcohol specifically be? Unconditioned stimulus. Being sick would be the unconditioned response, okay? You give my buddy enough alcohol, now he's gonna get sick, right? Okay, you don't have to, that doesn't become unlearned, okay? So again, know those terms, all 5 of those, be able to identify them. Now let's talk about operant conditioning. Who's the guy that came up with that concept? B.F. Skinner, okay? Now, one of the key differences between operant and classical conditioning is when the stimulus comes, when it affects the organism. So, in the case of classical conditioning, when is the stimulus? Before or after the behavior? Before. In operant conditioning, when is it? It's after. So that's one of the key differences. Also remember those 4 boxes we had to do with reinforcement and punishment, and then positive and negative. So let's start with punishment and reinforcement. If something makes a behavior more likely to occur, what is it? Reinforcement. If it's less likely to occur, punishment. If you add something, what is it? Positive. Take something away, negative. Okay? So let me give you some scenarios and I want you to tell me what it would be. discuss them. Okay, you guys getting extra credit for coming here. Positive reinforcement. So I'm encouraging you to study, right? So I've added something and I've made it more likely that you'll study. Okay? You getting a fine because you're speeding. You getting well, I guess it depends on how you look at that or phrase it, but if I take money away from you because you're speeding, right? So negative punishment. I add the ticket or I add difficulty, inconvenience, all that, positive punishment. Taking away money from you, negative punishment, okay? So again, on the test I'll have very clear scenarios so you won't get confused. How about back in the day when they allowed final test exemptions, what would that be? Negative reinforcement. They took something away that would make it more likely that you get good grades, okay? So you guys can identify those, you'd be good to go? Okay, good. All right, so besides those two ideas in the chapter, they also talked about social learning. Remember Bandura did a study with the Bowadal for that? What was the process that he was studying there? He had the kids watch and identify. They were watching the ladies beat up that big inflatable doll, and then he wanted to see if they would copy that behavior. What is that called?
Imitation.
Starts with an M. Give you some clues here. Modeling. Yep, modeling. So, Bandura found that modeling matters, but so does punishment and reinforcement, right? We also talked about the dogs in the Skinner box, and how they would shock the dogs, and the dogs would have to try to get away. And then we talked about the gnats and the rays, the rats in the maze as well. Remember how they had the rats going through the maze? And then when they started adding rewards, what happened to the number of errors that they exhibited?
It went down.
Went down, right? Even faster than people that didn't get the rewards. So that suggested that learning was occurring even though it wasn't being reinforced. What is learning that's occurring even though it's not manifesting itself called? Kind of gave you a clue there when I said if learning isn't manifesting itself, what's the opposite of manifest? Latent. Yep, so it's latent learning. How about the other process where the dogs would just lay down and try to get away? What's that called? What was it? No? Learned helplessness, exactly. So I gave some examples of that in class. I said studying for math for some people, right? Made fun of myself a little bit, me asking girls out in high school, right? Learned helplessness. Okay? All right, let's go to chapter 6. What was chapter 6 about again?
Memory.
See if you can remember what chapter 6 was about.
Memory.
Memory, good. So, if you remember, the assignment that we did for memory was to draw a graphic that explained the different parts of memory. If you saved a lot of these assignments, you would be able to study those and it would help you, right? Okay, so in that instance, I talked about the 3 processes of memory and then the 3 stages of memory. What are the 3 processes of memory first? E, S, and R. 3 processes of memory. No,
Encoding,
process.
storage, and retrieval.
Encoding, storage, and retrieval. Okay, now if you talk about types of memory, then it's sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So let's define encoding. What is that, first of all? What is encoding?
Hearing something.
Okay, it involves
Sensors.
echoic information, like hearing stuff, but also iconic, seeing stuff. Yeah, but it's the process by which you get information into your memory from the get-go. Okay? And then you have storage, that's where it's sitting there, not being used. And then you have retrieval. So retrieval is when you pull the information out and make it useful. What is it called? Like information that helps you in retrieving a memory. What are those called? Retrieval what?
Cues.
Retrieval cues. Okay. We also talked about a couple of different types of retrieval. What is it called when you're trying to retrieve something but you have very little retrieval cues to go by? Recall. Yep. How about if you have a lot of cues or more cues? Recognition. Good. Okay, we also talked about different types of memory again. When you break down long-term memory, you can divide that into different types. How do you break down long-term memory? What do you have?
Semantic and episodic.
You gotta go a step up first. Okay, declarative and, yep, or procedural is one type of non-declarative memory, but declarative and non-declarative, good. So procedural memory, habits, classically conditioned responses would be non-declarative memory. Okay, so procedural is like riding a bike, writing, shuffling a deck of cards, things like that. Okay? So then declarative memory, if you go a step down from that, like Parker said, you have episodic and semantic. So episodic is like 3 days from now, 4 days from now, whatever, you remember being in this place and where I sat and whatever. Okay? Semantic is actually remembering facts, information. So over time, if you're not using that information, if you're not pulling it out, you can lose that information, right? So what's the general loss of memory called? No, just the general term. Like we all experience some of this, even though we don't have amnesia in the disorder sense. Just the loss of memories over time is called what? Like if you don't, I'll give you some more retrieval cues here. If you don't brush your teeth, what are you gonna have? Decay, yep, tooth decay. So decay is the gradual loss of memory over time. Now, when it comes to getting the information in, if you just repeat it over and over again to try to remember it, what is that called?
Maintenance rehearsal?
What's that?
Maintenance rehearsal?
Yep, maintenance rehearsal. Good. So rehearsal in general is a strategy used to learn information. Maintenance rehearsal is just repeating it over and over again. So back in the day, when I was in like 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, we had these things we called mad minutes. You get like a piece of paper that had a whole bunch of multiplication problems on it. You try to solve as many as you could as fast as you could. Anybody do that? Okay. So rocket math you call it? So that's maintenance rehearsal, right? Telling stories or making up unique things to think about so that you remember something, what is that called? So the guy in the TED Talk used this process. He said, imagine you're riding, let's see if I can remember all the things now. You're riding into your house, and as you're walking in the house, you see this big nudist bicycle group crash in the front door. You go in the front door, Cookie Monster is sitting on Mr. Ed, a talking horse. You hear singing, you go in a little bit further, and Britney Spears is standing on your coffee table singing Hit Me Baby One More Time. And then the oven opens up, and out of the oven comes a road with the Tin Man, Scarecrow, and Cowardly Lion. The road's made out of gold all over your floor. Did I get it right? 4 parts of the story? So what type of rehearsal is that? Elaborative rehearsal. Which one's more effective? Maintenance or elaborative? Elaborative because you're building more connections. Yep. Okay, now a condition where you lose either past memories or the ability to form new memories, often as a response to an illness or an injury, is called what? Just the one word for it. We just said it a second ago.
Retro.
Amnesia. Yep. So there's 2 types of amnesia. What's the one where like I get hit in the head and I can't remember stuff in the past?
Retro.
Retrograde. I get hit in the head and I can't remember anything from the future. I remember like everything from that moment before, but I can't form new memories. What's that called? Anterograde. Good. Okay, that leads us to the last chapter, the chapter we were just on cognition. If you remember, cognition, we talked about thinking processes, we talked about intelligence, we also talked about methods of understanding intelligence and intelligence testing as well. So, and we talked about problem solving also. So, and then we finished with language. So it's thinking, intelligence, problem solving, language. So if I were to say store, what is store an example of as it relates to
Concept.
thinking? Store would be an example of a concept. Okay? When I say store, the first thing that pops into your mind for you is probably a what?
Store.
A what? Well, what did you just named the store, right?
Yeah.
What did you name?
The yogurt.
The yogurt place, because that's where we're at. Okay. So, but whatever you think of most of the time, that's going to be called what? I say, think of a store, think of a car, think of a dog. The specific example you think of is a prototype. So those are both units of thought. What is it called when I have you close your eyes and picture something? You actually see your mom, your dad, whatever. What unit of thought is that? A mental image. Good. Okay, so we also talked about types of intelligence. We talked about Sternberg's theories of intelligence. We talked about Gardner's theories of intelligence as well. To Sternberg, you had two types of intelligence. What were they? G and the S, so general and specific. Good. In Gardner, he initially had 8, and then he added another one to make there be 9. He had interpersonal, intrapersonal, logical, mathematical, visual, spatial, linguistic, kinesthetic, musical, naturalistic, and existential. Did I get them all? I missed one. Okay. So, be able to identify those and give examples. Okay? There's a few of those in there as well. We also talked about problem solving. If I were to say do this and you just randomly tried whatever over and over again until you figured it out, what would that be? Trial and error? Yeah. What if I said do this and then I threw you the directions? What would that be? An algorithm? What if I said do this and Libby stood up and it's like, hey, this is kind of like this. When I do this, I always do this. What is she using?
Heuristic.
A heuristic. Good. Okay. What does the Stanford-Binet intelligence test measure? IQ. How do you calculate that? Mental age divided by actual age. So they have tasks that people should be able to accomplish based on their actual age, and then they divide that based on their mental age, they divide that by their actual age and gives them an IQ. And then you have to times it by 100, right? So what's the average IQ score? 100. So good is better, worse is lower. Okay, we also talked about types of intelligence as it relates to problem solving, and I had you guys think of board games that represented each type. What were those two types of intelligence called?
Fluid.
Fluid and starts with a C. Fluid and crystallized. Okay. So when the math teachers did the Tetris thing, and they were like walking down the stairs and turning it to try to fit it up, what would that be an example of? Fluid or crystallized? Fluid. More fluid, because they're problem solving, right? They're trying to apply stuff. Their knowledge of different formulas, like the quadratic equation or Pythagorean theorem or whatever, what is that? crystallized. Okay, the ability to apply that and actually do something creatively and solve a problem is fluid intelligence. Okay. That is it for my portion. You can hit stop. If anybody has any specific questions they want me to answer, they can do so.